So a very warm welcome from me. I'm Caris Roberts and I'm Executive Director at IPPR. And very pleased to introduce so many of you to this IPPR North event on net zero places and a community-powered response to the climate crisis. I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping notes and then I'll introduce today's topic. So just a few bits of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and it will be available on our website. There's also a Q&A, will be a Q&A session once we've heard from our speakers. So if you've got general contributions, those can go in the chat box, but if you have specific questions you'd like our panelists to answer, please do use the Q&A box. So today we're here to talk about a new report that IPPR North have recently published, outlining how the transition to net zero can empower communities and enhance places. As part of this research, we use deliberative workshops as a means to directly involve citizens in the research. Through this, we established some key principles for how the just transition can take place, involving places and communities. You're going to hear more about that report from my colleague Johnny in a moment. And then I really want to get into the discussion today to understand how policymakers, businesses and public services can support communities to tackle the climate and nature crisis. We have an excellent panel of speakers with us today. So kicking us off will be Jonathan Webb. He is a senior research fellow at IPPR North with a focus on the causes and consequences of regional divides and also leading IPPR North's work on the environment. Next up, we have James Goodman, who is Director of Partnerships and Learning at Local Trust, a place-based funder that delivers the Big Local programme in which residents of 150 neighbourhoods across England have £1 million each to spend on improving their local community. Next, we have Kat Wong, who is an urban designer at URBED, Urbanism Environment and Design, an award-winning design and research consultancy based in Manchester. We have Keith Anderson, who is Chief Executive Officer for ScottishPower and a member of its board. Keith's also Chair of CBI Scotland and a COP26 business leader. And then finally, we have Andy Burnham, who is Mayor of Greater Manchester and has been since 2017. Just to flag that Andy's going to be joining us in about 10 minutes. So hopefully if his diary goes to plan, we'll be seeing him then. So first up, I'm going to...
I'm already here, Caris, just to say hi, everybody.
I was looking at my notes. So
Never been early in my life, so it's amazing, but here I am.
Brilliant. Welcome, Andy. So first up, I'm going to turn to Johnny to introduce the report.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caris. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and then I can begin. Brilliant. Thank you. So as Caris said, today I'm going to talk briefly about a new report that we published a couple of weeks ago, looking at net zero places and essentially how can we deliver a community-powered response to the climate crisis. So like all our research, we try and engage with some key problems. In this case, there's a few key problems and they're all interlinked. So we know now that the UK has to drastically reduce its emissions by 2050 to tackle the climate and nature crisis. However, I think it's fair to say that so far the net zero agenda has often been delivered in a top-down manner. Part of that is obviously because of the fact, we have UK-wide goals and things we have to do at the national level. But I think it's fair to say that so far, what policymakers, as well as what communities themselves can do at the subnational, local level and community level has by and large been overlooked in the net zero agenda. And what we want to do through our research is find a way to ensure that communities not only play a more active role in shaping policy, but also in visualizing the net zero places of the future. So essentially taking the idea of net zero from an abstract policy agenda, which people don't necessarily know what it means for their lives, and working closely with people to understand actually what are the wider benefits that can be delivered through this transition. So in terms of our research, what we wanted to do was develop that vision. And we wanted to look at what the net zero places of the future could look like. But crucially as well, ensure that when we did this, we were coming up with solutions which would empower communities to have a real say in their transition and what the places of the future would look like. So to do this, we organised 2 deliberative workshops with citizens to understand what they wanted from the net zero transition. And what we focused on was what we call two archetypal places. So, you know, I think in an ideal world, IPPR North would have looked to communities right across the country to do this, but unfortunately we were constrained by resources. But what we did was we focused in Liverpool City region as kind of a metropolitan urban area. And then we looked at a dispersed rural area in the form of the Isle of Anglesey to get a sense of what different places might want and what they might need from this transition. We also organised as part of this process policy roundtables across the northwest of England, as well as in North Wales, with policymakers, businesses, voluntary sector organisations and public services to understand how they can best support communities. So essentially understand what they're doing so far and what more they could do to support communities in developing their own visions for a net zero future. And the end outcome of this was we produced a report which generated policy principles which are designed to not only empower communities, but also reflect the outcomes of our deliberative workshops in terms of the things they said they wanted from the net zero transition. Before I can get in terms of the report, we tried to really produce quite a visually appealing report to capture the visions which people mentioned in the workshop. So here we have a kind of typical street scene. And what you'll notice is there's a lot of people. You know, right now, this is a typical street which we'd probably surrender a lot of this space to car travel. But what really improved in our workshops is people want more from their places. They want places which allow them not just to connect with one another, but connect with nature and really foster that sense of community. People really recognize that their places have a lot of heritage. They have a lot of pride in their places. But fundamentally, they want the net zero transition to not just deliver a better environment, but actually a better place, build on those assets and really make it about communities. So a transition for communities by communities. So in terms of the 7 policy principles we came up with, the reason we focused on 7 is to try and keep this as accessible as possible. And what we've done in developing these policy principles is tried to think about actions which cut across all levels of government. So there's a role for national government in all of this, as well as subnational government, thinking in particular about metro mayors in England, as well as local government, and a direct role for communities themselves. So first of all, the first key principle we came up with was about leaving no people or place behind on the road to net zero. It was really striking in our workshops that actually some people from specific groups, such as low-income households, as well as minority ethnic groups, felt excluded from the transition so far. So if we are to make this an inclusive process that really empowers places, we need to make sure we're including everyone, not just the people who have the resources and the information to be involved in this process. Secondly, harnessing community pride and giving neighbourhoods the power to shape the transition is really important. A lot of people take pride in the places that they live and they don't want it to be drastically changed. What they want is for that pride and that sense of place to be harnessed so that they can have a greater say. So it's about coming up with a more sensitive way of designing this net zero transition and understanding that sense of pride. Communities spoke a lot about where ownership lies in their community, and there was a real sense that actually this presents an opportunity to not just give communities more ownership over assets in their community, but also by shaping a more sustainable economy, we can create an economy that works better for local areas, works better for local places. Fourth, people wanted access to local information and opportunities to learn about the climate and nature crisis. And again, this is really important because what we're through in our workshops is that people are more receptive to information when it's delivered to them at the local level, when it's reflected in kind of, you know, how they understand their place and, you know, there's an understanding of what the impacts of this transition will mean for their place. They're much more receptive to those ideas. Fifth, in terms of public transport, people wanted to reimagine public transport that worked for everybody. It was really interesting to hear that despite there being a lot of focus at the national level on electric vehicles, even in very rural areas like the Isle of Anglesey, people were focused a lot more on public transport. No one wants to get in their car to travel somewhere, but actually they don't have those good local public transport links. So designing public transport that works for everybody, whether it's new forms of mass transit system or perhaps more demand responsive transport in certain places, is a really important part of this transition. 6, creating places for children that's designed for their future. There was a real recognition in these workshops that actually net zero places can really help foster a sense of community, but also help ensure that we create places that are not just designed for adults, but designed for children too. It's about their future ultimately. And finally, making sure we have space for nature and green spaces for people, not just in terms of being parks, and we think about things like parklets and other smaller areas where we allow nature to thrive in urban areas, and in more rural areas, ensure access to places too. And I think just quickly, just to end on a few visuals, again, this is an example of a cottage which has been retrofitted. This sort of speaks to the pride in place point, that actually people are quite receptive to ideas like housing retrofit, but fundamentally they want it to be done in a way where it reflects and retains the local character of the places that they have. So this is an example of, how you could retrofit a cottage in a rural area, add something new to it to make it energy efficient, but ensure that it's still kind of reflective of the place from which that building is from, and ensure you sort of retain that character of place. And finally, just one to end on, which is probably my favorite image in the report, is essentially thinking not just more about initiatives like active travel, but how this can open up better spaces for families, not just in cities, but in rural areas too. It was really striking listening to people, how much people hate essentially sitting in their cars as they take children to school. And actually, there's a real opportunity here to not just deliver lower emissions, but deliver a better standard of living for people and ensure that they can do things in a far more effective way, which also improves their broader standards. Okay, that's it. I'm going to end it there. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand back over to you, Karis.
Thanks very much, Johnny. And I'm going to turn to James from Local Trust next.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Hi, everyone. And I really welcome this report. It's great to see IPPR supporting community power. I'm going to argue that the climate crisis is the best argument we've got for community power, and the best opportunity for community power as well. So news is full at the moment of what's happening in Ukraine. If you look at the margins, there are huge floods going on in Australia. And what's particularly striking when I was reading about these was how, yet again, where the government response was lacking to the floods, local communities stepped in, organising resources, organising rescues, organising food and fuel drops, and starting the cleanup process. And when crisis hits, that is typical. And we saw that in this country with COVID as well. In the chaos of the early lockdown and the empty shelves, it was local self-organising groups that were the first to step in with their local knowledge, with their local relationships and resources. And looking across the big local network of 150 neighbourhoods across England, the number of big local partnerships that were doing emergency food work more than doubled overnight. And the majority were involved in that way. Sale West, big local in southern Manchester, was one of those. And they, because of the local relationships that they had built up over time, that local connectivity, they were able to organise food and medicine distribution, mobilise volunteers, scaled up really quickly. And they actually ended up being designated the central coordinating hub for Sale during that time. So this is not universal though. And actually during COVID, we saw that where there was less community activity already, where there were fewer voluntary organizations, less connectivity, less social infrastructure, there were fewer mutual aid groups developing in response to the pandemic. And actually, those areas attracted less funding from government and from trusts and so on. And of course, those areas tended to suffer more from the impacts of COVID as well. So bringing this to climate change, we have a challenge to adapt to the climate crisis, because the climate crisis is hitting whether or not we decarbonise. And the UK's climate change risk assessment has recently published a report saying we are not prepared, and we need a huge amount of work to do to build physical infrastructure resilience. But we also need social resilience. We also need social infrastructure to adapt to and thrive if we can during a time of climate crisis. So the point is that community is critical for that kind of resilience, but we don't support community enough. And there are some places where community is strong and there are others where it is not strong. And we need to invest and support communities in those places. And that means supporting individual skills and capacity development. And it means so people can participate and lead local change and feel involved. And it means supporting social infrastructure, places for people to meet, relationships, local institutions, and it also means resource to local people. And that's why we think that a community wealth fund, which we and hundreds of other organisations are advocating at the moment, to give power and decision-making, money and decision-making power to residents in left-behind neighbourhoods across the country, is one of the most important things that government can do in response to the climate crisis. So that's adapting to a world of climate crisis, but we also need to get our emissions down, obviously, radically. Most of the emissions cuts that the UK has made so far have been as a result of national scale structural changes. What comes next is much more local. I think it's interesting to observe that a lot of the conversation about what we can do for to combat climate change is down to what, our energy use, our car consumption, our pension, flights, and so on. The narrative tends to atomize us, put us into individuals, and talks about our consumption. And that immediately puts us into a position of what do we need to give up? And that's actually totally irrelevant to millions of people in this country, and excludes them from, I think, from being part of the transition, which would be a tragic mistake, would undermine the transition. So when it comes to decarbonising, we need an assets-based approach that invests in local communities. It is a huge opportunity for us to level up. Climate action can level us up, but it isn't always necessary to frame it as climate action. And so another big local area, Lawrence Weston on the outskirts of Bristol, has done a huge amount to that aligns with a zero carbon economy. They've combated fuel poverty by retrofitting poor quality housing. They've taken a stake in a solar farm that's generating income for the community. They've got Secretary of State approval for a huge wind turbine, 4.5 megawatts, which will also generate income for the community. All of that has been done to improve the community and to address poverty, not to address the climate crisis. So in a question of framing it for them and for many other communities to really shift power to communities, it's about community development in an age of climate crisis and thinking in a way, what can the climate crisis do for your community rather than what can you do as a community to tackle the climate crisis? Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. Really interesting comments. Next up, we have Kat from URBED.
Thanks, Harry. Do you have the slides I've prepared? There's only a few of them. Just get that up. Oh, 1 minute. Right. So, so these slides kind of relate to this project I've been working on as part of URBED, called Oldham Energy Futures, based in Oldham, and we've been working in partnership with the Carbon Co-op. Project has involved 12 local representatives from their neighbourhood areas, and we've been working with these local representatives to develop local energy future action plans in these areas. And in these action plans, there are actions to tackle the decarbonisation of neighbourhood systems, and then also looking at the kind of transition to net zero. The two communities are have different conditions. One is based in the kind of edge of the town centre in an urban area called Westwood, and the other is called Shoulder. It's an kind of urban rural edge community. And we've taken the two community groups through like an energy future action planning process. And this is where we've started to diagnose some of the challenges and project opportunities to decarbonise the neighbourhood energy system, and have taken them through a process of knowledge building. I found that it's been really interesting and really useful for the communities to start to build a kind of tangible knowledge framework for engaging with net zero transition. And we arranged a kind of a set of workshops in these local communities to explore a series of low carbon energy themes. And this framework is organised around these themes. So the themes have looked at the idea around kind of improving sustainable transport and travel options in the communities, looking at how we can start to improve energy efficiency across the homes in the neighbourhoods, and looking at opportunities for renewable energy generation and community energy projects across these neighbourhoods. And I think what's been really great is that it's given the communities an opportunity to understand what actions can be delivered on an individual level, as well as the neighbourhood-wide level. So on an individual level, the community members have got a raised awareness of what they can do in their area. So individual actions such as sharing home energy advice and scaling up on DIY draft proofing skills in their homes, where they've identified issues around issues around drafts, which is like contributing to high energy bills. And as well as the individual level, it's actually helped them to understand what they can do on that neighborhood-wide level with the wider community. So the local residents, they have started to kind of get to an understanding of what the transition would mean in their neighborhood. And some of the residents have started to go out and share this knowledge with other people in their local community. And part of the actions that have come out of this process has been that they want to now start to engage with other stakeholders and local organisations to see what they can do with them in partnership to deliver some of the actions on these action plans. The next slide. So in this Energy Future Action Planning process, we've looked at bringing in data that's readily available about the issues around air pollution, issues around kind of fuel poverty, and as well as bringing in data around solar potential in the neighbourhood, so on the rooftops. And this data has been quite important to equip the local residents and raise awareness of what can be done in the area. So what are the priorities for local action? How do we start to tackle some of these issues in the area, and what projects can be generated from this? And we've also started to understand from their perspective what the kind of place-based opportunities are, and that's kind of really been key to kind of integrate both the kind of data as well as the kind of experiences of local people and that knowledge. So yeah, mapping has been really key to this. So kind of identifying in the urban environment what the quality of the public realm is, you know, if there are issues around that which is stopping people from being able to enjoy the kind of community spaces in the neighborhood, or if there are issues around kind of accessing transport options. So really kind of getting a feel of how that contributes to then the barriers to sort of movement and active travel in the neighborhoods. And then there's that image on the right, which is identifying kind of EPC ratings across the neighborhood. And that's kind of identifying where there are areas where there are lower EPC ratings, so ranging from E to G, where maybe there's priority areas around retrofitting homes in that neighborhood. So it's kind of a bit of an eye-opener for people in those neighborhoods to kind of understand actually what kind of things they can start to tackle, and what are the tangible actions that can come out of the process. And I think part of it is really around tying these kind of energy actions into how that can benefit the wider community, and embed the kind of aspirations and priorities that are already existing within these local communities. So things which you know, they find that they're struggling with, and how actually these kind of net zero action can actually contribute to the social benefits within the neighborhood. The next slide. Okay, so yeah, there's lots of opportunities, and I think there should be an emphasis on connecting the kind of wider social benefits with net zero actions. So there's opportunities for delivering training on a local level, and equipping people with skills in the area, and supporting a local green economy. There's great opportunities to address or the opportunity to develop energy generation projects, and which then in turn create these kind of local income pots for communities to then develop further community projects. Improving the kind of built environment in the area to make it more triad friendly, as that obviously read the report touched on in Liverpool, and developing more kind of walkable streets. And then there's also the kind of opportunity to really address the rising cost of living, and addressing kind of food poverty in areas, and that contributing to reducing kind of the energy bills for people. So I think by connecting kind of the net zero actions and see it as like an opportunity as well to tackle additional issues in an area, and seeing that holistically is really key. And that's what we've been kind of driving within this Oldham project. And I think in terms of actions, this kind of does need to connect with kind of wider strategic local authority actions, and align with like the government targets as well. And I think that in this process with communities, it's a good opportunity to introduce these targets and explain what those actually mean for people. And actually then they can understand the connection between policy and local action. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kat. So next up, we are going to turn to Keith.
Hi there, thank you, and look, thanks for inviting me along. I've found it fascinating so far, and I'm not going to disagree with anything that's been said up until now, but maybe just give you a slightly different perspective on the challenge and the opportunity, and what we're looking to do from the perspective of a big company and a big investor involved in all of this. I think we've been really focused on this all the way through last year and in the run up to COP about how is it we transition to net zero. And what became very obvious to me and to us as a company was you can't do this to people, and therefore you have to have this whole concept of involving communities, involving people, and you get to start talking about just transitions, etc. About how is it people feel that they have a say in what's happening, and how is it people get involved in what's happening, and the planning of it and the delivery of it, and it becomes incredibly important, because we'll never achieve what we want to achieve without that. We issued a couple of reports last year, one on zero carbon communities, and then one also on a just transition strategy as well, that try to put down on paper some of the ideas as to how we could look at this and get involved in it. And one thing that became one thing that's great, I think, in terms of the opportunity, and I listened to what the other speakers have been saying, which is it doesn't really much matter whether you're coming at this from a big energy investor's perspective, a transport perspective, a heat perspective, whether you're looking at it from a local community point of view, whether it's being done to improve lives or tackle pollution, or whether it's being done for the greater good of the environment and net zero. I think the great opportunity is we're seeing all of these things converge, and they're starting to converge really for the first time. So, if I'd gone back 5 years, the thought of the energy sector and the transport sector working together, it was just, you couldn't have found two things further apart in the world. But they're all starting to come together, and I see that all of this around communities, around local regions getting more involved, about people getting involved. It's all starting to pull together and come together in terms of what we all want and what we're trying to deliver. We're just maybe coming at it from a different perspective. I think for us, a lot of this ends up being about how do you decentralize decision making that's being taken to now. And maybe the best example I could give you of that is part of what we own and invest in is the distribution system. For a lot of people, that's completely invisible because it's the cables that are under the ground, under the streets, that feed into local community halls, hospitals, schools, and into your house and into your home. And that needs a huge amount of re-engineering and investment to allow all of this to happen, whether it's the decarbonisation of transport, be that electric vehicles at people's homes, or be it the electrification of the public transport system. It's around the decarbonisation of heat. And again, whether that's individual houses buying a heat pump, or whether it's the decarbonisation of heating for local authorities and housing associations, there needs to be a huge amount of investment in that background infrastructure. And that's one of the big points where right now that is so centralised, it's unbelievable. So that's all driven by a conversation we as a company have with a regulator and a centralised regulatory body in terms of how much money goes into it, when it gets invested in it, how it gets invested in it. And it's one of the big drivers we've got is, how do you decentralise that and get the local communities involved? So whether that's being done at a mayoral level for big cities or big metropolitan regions, or whether it's being done in rural communities, there needs to be a voice there from the community to say, here's what we want on transport. This is how we want to tackle the transport conundrum in our local area. This is how we want to tackle the heating challenge and opportunity in our area. To me, it's a complete anathema that I should decide that with a centralised regulator and just come and do it to you. So we need to flip that model and decentralise that model and get the local regions and local communities involved in saying, this is what we need. Therefore, if you're coming to invest in our area, here's how it should be done, and here's where it should be done. And I think that starts to open up a really, really interesting conversation about how you get local communities involved, because it's about their neighbourhood, it's about their local transport system, it's about their local heating system, and that's what we need to do. It's great for me as an investor in big renewables projects. It's a great thing for us to do as an organisation to decarbonise the generation system, which we're doing onshore wind, offshore wind, solar. But the only purpose of doing that is to get it to the local community, to get it to the customer, the homeowner, the local school. And it's about, how do we get that power there, and how are you then able to use it, whether it's through a heat pump or an electric car or an electric bus. We're currently investing in a hydrogen project just outside Glasgow, and we're working with the local council in Glasgow because they want to use hydrogen for buses and for dustbin lorries, which is a fantastic tie-up and a link-up. And it's more of that we want to see happening, is those conversations with whether it's local councils, local authorities, local communities, whether it's with mayoral offices, is get that link up and that tie up, so the investment is being directed in exactly the right way. So it's being directed in a way that helps us achieve net zero, but it's being directed in a way that helps improve the local community, and it gives them a route map to being involved and an involvement in getting to net zero as well. So that's the big push for us just now. And we're having this conversation all around the country with different organisations to try and see how we can tackle that. But one of the biggest conundrums is, how do you unlock those and decentralise those centralised processes and centralised regulatory processes now? And how do we find a way of allowing the regulator to decentralise its power, its authority and its control to dictate where the money goes and how the money goes? So big, massive opportunity, huge, big challenge as well. But you're absolutely convinced that's what we need to do, because otherwise we'll never deliver what people want, and therefore people will never think they're properly involved in it.
Thank you very much, Keith. And I had a question to remind people of your organisation. So Keith is Chief Executive Officer at ScottishPower. So thank you for that contribution. And finally, I'm going to turn to Andy.
Thanks very much, Caris. I'll try and be reasonably brief so that you can get into Q&A before the hour's out. But I very much agree with what other speakers have said. The race to net zero can't be won top down by just imposing diktats and rules and forcing people to do things. It's got to be won in the opposite direction, bottom up, with communities, with people, winning hearts and minds. And I think that last point is quite an important one in the context of the way some on the right of politics are now talking, i.e. a referendum is needed on, in their words, net zero madness. You know, there is a very kind of big challenge to be won here still, I think, in the post-pandemic world. And I don't think it would make sense to take this for granted that everyone is just raring to go, and you know, there's an argument to be won. And I think the way you win it, I would go to something what Kat said, to be honest. I think for me, if you just think about where we are as a society right now, you know, we're coming through a fairly traumatic 2 years, and there are other big global events taking place right now. Obviously, what's happening in Ukraine that is going to kind of make the recovery even more difficult. As a cost of living crisis, as people have said, you know, this is tough for people. The world has been through continuous shocks, it feels, for a number of years now. And I would say, well, in that context, well, how do you get people to buy into another thing that it's, you know, people have got to do, and they would say there's already a lot on their plate? Well, you've got to bring these things together, I think, as other speakers are saying, and that's very much what we feel we need to do. You know, when the tide went out, if you like, in March 2020, and COVID revealed the kind of reality, and we kind of knew what we knew about Greater Manchester, but it kind of was really revealed by the pandemic, in terms of some people not having jobs where they could go home even if they were ill, because that was not the nature of the employment that they had. You know, that homes didn't support good health, and consequently some of our communities struggled with a very high case rate all the way through the pandemic. You know, a lot of kids couldn't do their work because they didn't have data connectivity at home. You know, these are the things that have been revealed, and I think we've got to be there, if you like, before we start. If we're going to win this sort of argument about net zero, you've got to be there before you're saying, oh, net zero, net zero, net zero, because other people may have things that are more urgent for them in terms of, you know, what needs to change. And I think we've got to be in the language first of, we've got to give better jobs for people. We've got to give people better homes. We need better transport. And actually, the interesting thing is, net zero can be a catalyst to all of those things. And you know, I would agree with what I think James said, and everyone in different ways, about, you know, getting the kind of framing of this right. It can be the route to levelling up, but you've got to be really explicit about that and not make net zero the end in itself, because then people will say, well, what does that leave you with? You could actually, depending on how you go at this, you could go on a drive to net zero over the next 20 or so years and end up with an even less equal country than the one we've already got, if we leave the costs of that falling on individuals. And so how you do this is sort of really, really important. And for us, this is where our thinking is, and I'll probably draw things to a close, Karis, at this point, and then let people open to questions. We're having a big event next Monday, which is what we're calling the new era in Greater Manchester. So post-pandemic, we are going to set out where we're going. And for us, the new era is defined. It's 2022 now to 2038, which is our science-based target for a net zero city region. And what we'll be saying next week is that we are going to use this journey to make Greater Manchester fairer, more equal, better jobs for everybody, better homes, better public transport. So take the public transport example. I've taken the decision to put buses back under public control. That in itself allows you to decarbonise the transport system more quickly. But it's more than that, isn't it? We want better standard, consistent public transport at London level fares. You know, that's what we want. Reduce the cost of living for people. Or if you take something else like retrofitting, we've got to retrofit every home in that kind of 2022, 2038 time window. Well, actually, that can be a major home improvement programme to not just make the homes net zero, but to kind of make them much better in terms of supporting health, building out good physical and mental health in our communities. And actually, by doing that, you can create thousands of good jobs from a retrofitting programme, secure jobs, because they're going to be needed for a long time. So that's where we're coming at this. You know, we would almost say you've got to create a fairer Greater Manchester first, a more equal Greater Manchester. And actually your route to do that is accelerating your response to net zero. But I think this is an open question at the moment, because people kind of hear greener and they kind of think, well, is that going to be, am I going to be paying for that? And we've just had a difficult debate about a clean air zone for Greater Manchester, which I can touch on in questions if people are interested. So do not take it as a given that the argument is won and everyone's ready to go on this journey. I think the post-pandemic world is presenting a lot of challenges for people. And I think you've got to kind of say, as Kat was saying, this is your route to much more affordable public and better public transport. It's your route to lower energy bills and a home that's cheaper to run. It's a route to better jobs for young people particularly. So I would just leave it there. You know, that I think is the way this debate needs to be framed. Almost the sort of the bigger benefits come first, if you like, and net zero is the means by which you get them.
Fantastic, thanks, Andy. And I think you've actually inadvertently or perhaps advertently answered some of the questions coming in, so that's great. Do please keep sending your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat, so that I can turn to them. And we've got about 15 minutes with our panel to answer those now. I wondered if I could kick us off with some of the questions are asking about how we can involve a really diverse range of communities in this work and genuinely bring as many people to the table in a just way. That's a question from Amy, but there are other questions as well, speaking to a similar point of, you know, not everybody being equally able to participate or to be aware of the kinds of things that we're talking about. I wondered if I could turn to Kat and to James with that one first, based on your experience. Kat, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so just based on the experience in the Old Energy Futures project, we had an early on recruitment process to kind of understand what the demographics were of the area and to identify some of the local community leaders in the area. They helped us to kind of think about, okay, who to be involved in the process, and also kind of maybe some of those barriers to engagement. And they suggested actually to support people to be involved with like a stipend, and actually that kind of helped with people being able to get to the workshops, being able to, you know, take time off work and really participate on an equal level. And I think that's actually really key in this, is that people do give their time and energy in the process, and I think it's really important to kind of respect that as part of this the participatory process. So that's kind of I think that answers one of the questions that I mentioned. If anyone wants to add to
that. James, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so we talk about left behind neighbourhoods and think about those communities that are relatively lacking in social capital and social infrastructure, connectivity, places to meet, lower in participation and equally deprived as other places. We did a survey with IPPR actually of attitudes to climate change for the people who are living in those most marginalised communities in England, and surprise, surprise, attitudes to climate change were not different from the population as a whole. There's not a difference in priority. People are concerned wherever. But we heard that people really saw the potential benefits of a net zero society for them, but felt like they weren't involved and wanted to be more involved in it. So there's desire for people to get involved if the means are there. And I think the other thing I'd like to say about that is that we cannot assume that people in communities have the capacity to get involved. At that point around, you know, paying time and so on, I think that's really critical. There's also something about skills and confidence and the time. You know, many people just don't have the time to get involved in community activity. They don't have haven't had the opportunity to develop a sense of agency and step forward and so on. And that's why we need to support individuals to have that attitude to change, to be able to get involved and so on, and feel a sense of agency and be involved. And for that, you know, you need a thriving community where people can actually come together. You know, so there are many places where that isn't the case, and it's very hard to involve a community where there is no community. We need to invest in the communities to start with, or alongside.
Great, thank you. The next question I want to turn to is from Alice, and it's about rural areas. So Alice says there seems to be major challenges for really rural areas that aren't being covered. Just over 2,000 people living in an isolated rural area, 20 miles to anywhere, mostly over high passes, have no benefits of scale, not a hope for any meaningful public transport, and once the feed-in tariffs were removed, little chance of developing community energy. We tried. Any ideas? Keith, Johnny, I don't know if either of you want to turn to that one.
Yeah, so look, it is a challenge, but I think when you start to look at this debate around transport, then one thing that's very, very clear is that we can't just roll out the electrification of transport to those people that can either afford it or where it makes, if you like, direct commercial sense to install a charge point. So there are companies running around just now installing public electric vehicle charge points at places of high traffic flow, because commercially it makes sense to do that. What's quite clear is there are whole parts of the countryside where you'll never be able to generate a commercial return just from installing it and people plugging their car in. And so we need to have a different model. And that's a model that's going to work with the local authority, the local community, and the regulator in terms of funding it and implementing it. And that's why I'm saying we need to get that process decentralized so that we can make those decisions and install those things. In terms of public transport, then it should be an easier conversation again with local authorities around what they want to do around decarbonising their existing public transport fleet over a period of time. And that can either be done through electricity or through hydrogen. And then there will always be companies like ours who will invest in the facilities and the production. Producing hydrogen is not the issue, or producing the electricity is not the issue. That's relatively easy and simple to resolve. The issue is to make sure there's a linkage to the usage and the output of it. And then, in terms of local renewables projects, again, there are lots of models there available, and we've used several of them about how people can get involved in that. So again, if we want to build, if somebody wants to build a wind farm in and around a local area, then we're happy to invest. There are plenty of people happy to invest in building a wind farm, and they will open it up to some kind of community involvement. There are hundreds of models, from the simple, the wind farm gets built and there's a trust fund set up to put money back into the local economy, all the way through to offering people in the local area the ability to invest directly in and put money into the building of the wind farm and get a return on it. So again, there's no barrier through remoteness or size. There are projects being built in that nature that are 2 or 3 turbines all the way through to huge big projects that can offer that flexibility and those options.
Great, thanks, Keith. Next up, Andy, people are enthusiastically taking up on your offer to talk about the clean air zone. We have some questions about what the community response was, whether the community will be involved in future, and the extent to which you need to get everyone on board or accept there'll always be a vocal minority.
I mean, it is worth talking about because it's obviously been a very challenging process, Karis. And I think one of the problems with it is how it grew as a policy, because it was very legally driven to begin with the case. I'm not saying the client were wrong to take the case, far from it, but because of that, I think it was a reactive policy at national government level, and then was handed down to the councils, the 10 councils in our case. And so the case for it was never fully made at a national level, I don't think. It was just, oh, we've got to do this because the court has said, and then we'll offload the problem onto local government. And as with all things, it was imposed without the funding. And it's the point I was making before, that's going to be a real problem here. If you require people to do things and then don't fund the change, it's just going to create a backlash if you're not careful. So in our case, we kind of worked to design a plan that was signed off by the government, but it was in effect for pre-pandemic times. And it was always going to collide then with a new reality on the other side of the pandemic, which it did, but it didn't have enough funding in it. You know, we were always worried about that, and became more worried last year when the vehicle market started to show signs of serious price inflation, and that's where I guess, you know, it really you know, came apart. But it is linked as well to the reality of now, which is the cost of living crisis. I mean, you just can't escape any of that, can you? You can't ask people to do things without cognizance of energy bills, I think, as Kat was saying, food bills. And so, you know, change that we're talking about has to be kind of you know, done in this context. I mean, we remain committed to cleaning up the air as quickly as we can. I mean, the truth of the matter is we just couldn't do it by 2024 because the vehicles are not there. They, you know, they wouldn't be able to be provided, even if you know, we kind of went with that. The possibility had gone according to the evidence. And the risk always was, the reason why I think the backlash came is because if you're going to carry on and try and do something but then do it by just charging people, particularly when they can't really escape those charges, then I think the greener will feel unfairer to people. And that is a big, if you get into that place, I think you've lost those hearts and minds. And then how do you get that accelerated action? So we would say, we are saying back to the government, incentives are a better way of doing this than charges. You know, give people genuine incentives and support to change. And actually, you probably can achieve change more quickly if you work in that approach. And I think it's a good way to think about the net zero change more broadly. You know, free up people who want to go fast to do it and support them to do it. And by helping those early adopters, then you probably bring down the cost of the challenge for everybody else. So there are plenty of learning points. You know, the consultation I don't think was good enough with communities. You know, we kind of designed this thing, the pandemic hit, the world was changing, our focus was on the pandemic. And so, you know, there's lots of learning points here. But the truth of the matter is, this is where the top-down thing goes really wrong. If the government just imposes things and doesn't provide the support, then you've got the conditions there, I think, for the loss of hearts and minds in a completely, you know, or people go in a different direction and they don't buy in. So I think it is something that people need to really think about and understand, because I do think it has wider learning points for getting that broad-based public support bottom up for the change that we all know we need to make to improve health, but also to obviously meet our climate commitments.
Thanks, Andy. And that point about resources, we have some questions about how to pay for community development as well. So Stuart has asked, how do we pay for this community development in a capitalist system expecting returns on investment? We know the economic benefits will be enormous, but they will be dispersed, often in savings to society. A key part to engaging communities is to provide funding for the responses. Does the Preston model of community wealth building work in this case? How should we seek to fund and pay for this? Johnny, I might turn to you first.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question and quite a difficult question to answer, but I think there's a couple of things that can be considered about this. I think, first of all, finding ways to give community more assets for themselves is really important, not just in terms of kind of giving them a tangible resource which they can kind of, you know, benefit from in economic terms, but in terms of kind of the point that Andy just made about winning hearts and minds, giving people a direct stake, as in a direct economic stake in their communities, and linking that to the transition is really important. So it serves two purposes there. I think more broadly, we also need to kind of think about the general funding climate in the in reality, it's just not enough support on offer for communities and for people within communities. You know, you look at things like EV charging infrastructure, or, you know, things like installing heat pumps in the home. And the reality is it simply isn't enough. £4,000 towards a contribution of a heat pump installation, for example, if you're a lower income household and it's going to cost you £12,000 to install it because you have to insulate your home, it simply isn't enough. So I think really that it goes back to, you know, what is central government's current support to communities, and actually it's not going far enough, and it needs to find a way of targeting those households who will need more assistance to kind of make this journey. And I think only by doing that, you're going to start seeing the wider community action. I think that point about the Preston model again is also really interesting and really important. And I think that speaks more broadly to enabling communities and enabling places to invest more and incentivize investments in net zero. So can we find ways, for example, when we're thinking about procurement, to actually make sure that the services we're procuring, they're not just providing an economic benefit and a social benefit, but there's a clear kind of climate benefit there. I think thinking smartly about those sorts of initiatives as well are really important. And fundamentally, you kind of need all three of those things acting together. So in terms of kind of central government funding, making sure we're supporting lower income households and giving communities a direct stake in some of those future green assets, I think that's all really important for funding this transition.
Thanks, Johnny. James, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that point as well.
That was a really good answer from Johnny. I'll just add in, much can be done to foster community, bottom-up community economic development, and so much of the opportunity for the future is coming from a zero carbon economy. The future economy is zero carbon, otherwise we don't have a future economy. That's the bottom line. And so where we're supporting grassroots economic activity, it should all align with a zero carbon future and align with the opportunity agenda. And I'll just repeat what I said earlier about a community wealth fund. If we can divert some resource from freed up dormant assets for other sources to go directly into people's hands in communities to spend on their own terms in communities to improve things, that is a huge enabler of this future economy, I think.
Thanks, James. Andy,
I'll just throw an example in, Caris, very quickly of just what James was saying. So I'm just about to create a green spaces fund that will be not about big spaces, but pocket parks, really small areas that will be very much community controlled at the very local level. And I think, to get it to a positive at the end, I think if you can build some of the capacity that James and Jonathan are talking about through that kind of initiative, it can then kind of move on to other things as well, can't it? So we're just going to go live on that quite soon, and it's about building that sense of agency, just making small change happen, and then that can lead to other change. So I absolutely agree with that, and I do think we do need to invest in capacity building at that local level.
And there are, just briefly, Caris, there are also, just picking up on that point, there are also some ways of doing that quite neatly through, although it's a slightly clunky centralised regulatory system and funding system. But in the last year, Ofgem allowed each of the distribution companies to go out and speak to the local communities to identify what could be defined as net zero projects, but they were all based around improving local areas and local communities. And we invested an additional 60 to 70 million pounds in small local projects that were improving a local area, but could also be related to decarbonisation and to net zero. So again, there are ways, and the great thing about that is that cost gets socialised across the whole system, and it gets spread over 40 years. So there's some nice, neat ways of using local funding and support mechanisms in areas, using centralised regulatory processes, as well as using market-based processes. And we need to use every tool, every funding and financing tool in the box to get access to the money.
Fantastic. So I'm going to draw us to a close, as I know that everyone will have busy afternoons ahead of them, but just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers for coming along today and offering your perspective. It's been a really interesting discussion, and also a huge thanks to everybody who's on the call. A really rich discussion in the chat, and apologies that we couldn't get to every single question. I will see if we can pass them on to our panelists so they can take a look later. But for now, thanks very much, everybody, and speak soon.